Hi, scholars. In this video, I wanted to address what are called the three pillars of photography, aka the most important ideas that good photographers must know. The three pillars of photography are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let's get straight into it.
First, let's talk about shutter speed. To understand shutter speed, you need to know what shutter means. Shutter speed exists because of camera shutter, which is a curtain in front of the camera sensor that stays closed until the camera fires. When the camera fires, the shutter opens and fully exposes the camera sensor to the light that has passed through the lens. After the sensor is done collecting the light, the shutter closes immediately, stopping the light from hitting the sensor. The button that fires the camera is also sometimes called the shutter or shutter button because it triggers the shutter to open and close. Shutter speed refers to the length of time the camera shutter is open, exposing light onto the camera's sensor. Essentially, it's how long your camera spends taking the photo. This has a few important effects in how your images will appear. When you use a long shutter speed, you end up exposing your sensor for a significant period of time. The first big effect of this is motion blur. If your shutter speed is long, moving objects in your photo will appear blurred along the direction of motion. This effect is used quite often in advertisements of cars and motorbikes, where a sense of speed and motion is communicated to the viewer by intentionally blurring the moving wheels. On the other hand, shutter speed can also be used to do just the opposite, freeze motion. If you use an especially fast shutter speed, you can eliminate motion even from fast moving objects like birds in flight or cars driving past. If you use a fast shutter speed while taking pictures of water, each droplet will hang in the air completely sharp, which might not even be visible to your own eyes. In summary, quick shutter speeds freeze action, while long ones create an effect of motion when you photograph moving objects. You can see an example of how this changes the photo in these three photos of a pinwheel. Next up, we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is the opening in a lens where light passes to enter the camera. It is an easy concept to understand if you just think about how your own eyes work. As you move between bright and dark environments, the iris in your eyes either expands or shrinks, controlling the size of your pupil. In photography, the pupil of your lens is called aperture. You can shrink or enlarge the size of aperture to allow more or less light to reach your camera sensor. Aperture can add dimension to your photos by controlling depth of field. At one extreme, aperture gives you a blurred background with a beautiful shallow focus effect. On the opposite end of the aperture spectrum, it will give you sharp photos from the nearby foreground to the distant horizon. On top of that, it also alters the exposure of your images by making them brighter or darker. In these images, you can see that as the aperture number gets larger, the lens becomes more narrow. The picture of the flower shows that when the aperture is wide, the background becomes blurry. When the aperture is narrow, the image is sharper and you can make out more of the image. Both have their own artistic value. Next, let's look at ISO. ISO is one of the hardest settings to get just right. In very basic terms, ISO is simply a camera setting that will brighten or darken a photo. As you increase your ISO number, your photos will grow brighter. For that reason, ISO can help you capture images in darker environments. However, raising your ISO has consequences. A photo taken at too high of an ISO will show a lot of grain, also known as noise, and it might not be usable. So brightening a photo via ISO is always a trade-off. You should only raise your ISO when you are unable to brighten the photo via shutter speed or aperture. In this series of photos of a rainbow, you can see how ISO changes the appearance of the photo. At a low ISO, the photo is very dark, and you can barely make out what is in the image. As the ISO gets higher, the image gets brighter and brighter, but there is some noise or distortion in the later photos. That concludes this video about the three pillars of photography. Next, we're going to talk about some aesthetic principles of photography and also learn about how to get the most out of our smartphone cameras. Until next time, stay safe, scholars.